Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So welcome to the Bioethics Colloquium. Sorry about the delay. There was the exam. I didn't want to rush the kids. One of them was still scribbling away as we came in, so kind of felt bad for them. But yeah, so welcome to the Bioethics Colloquium. Today we're really delighted to have Professor Nelkin from the University of California, San Diego. She is the professor of philosophy at UCSD. Her research interests range over moral psychology, ethics, the intersection of ethics and law, bioethics, and psychology. She's one of the leading experts on free will and moral responsibility. She's published a book called with Oxford University Press called Making Sense of Freedom and Responsibility. And she has many articles on this topic, including difficulty and degrees of moral praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, which is forthcoming in the news. And another paper with ethics called Psychopaths, Incorrigible Racists, and the Faces of Responsibility. And today she's going to talk about friendship, freedom, and special operations. Is it working? I think I turned it off. Did I turn it off? You want to just continue?
Okay. Oh, that worked. Okay. So first of all, it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you to Matthew for the invitation, and to all of you for being here. So I'm talking about something that's a bit new for me. And that is the topic of friendship and special obligations. As you'll see, it's connected with some of the things I've thought about for a long time, like moral responsibility and freedom. But I'm be very grateful for your feedback in the Q&A. Okay, so just to start with a bit of background. So we'll start with the problem of free will. So people have worried about whether we have free will for a very long time, millennia, I guess. And one way of seeing how the problem arises is to think about the possibility that determinism is true in our world. If the world is determined, so the past together with the laws of nature entail some particular future state, then how could we be free agents? That's a question. And you might think, well, look, even if something like determinism is true, still, how does that help us if you add a little bit of randomness to the world? Still, how is it that we could be free agents? Okay, and our world seems to be something like that. So this worry has, exercised people for a very long time. And one of the big reasons that you find in the literature now is the worry about free will is that, if we don't have that, then we're not morally responsible agents. And so we can't be blameworthy or praiseworthy for anything. That's at least one big worry that's you find a lot in the literature right now. But that's not the only thing that people have worried about. And one of the things that people have thought to be at stake in the free will debate is friendship and personal relationships more generally. And so, for example, Robert Kane, in his influential book called The Significance of Free Will, lists friendship as one of the 10 items. Here are the 10 things that are threatened by the idea that we don't have free agency. And Susan Wolf is so eloquent, I have to quote her. Here's what she says about free will. She says, the most gruesome difference between a world in which we give up our practices that depend on the assumption that we're free agents and our world would be reflected in our closest human relationships. And although we could form, quote, some sort of associations that could be described as relationships of friendship and love, the words friendship and love would take on a hollow ring. We would inhabit a world of human isolation so cold and dreary that any but the most cynical must shudder at the idea of it. Okay, so just to give you a little drama, so how much is at stake here if we're not free agents? Okay, now interestingly, Kane and Wolf, though they both think that friendship is at stake in the free will debate, they come at it from very different ways. So Robert Kane, for example, he thinks what freedom comes into friendship because freely choosing your relationships makes the relationships more valuable. So I call this the free choice connection. This is on your handout. That's where he thinks freedom comes into it. Susan Wolf, I think, also in the same tradition as Peter Strawson in his famous Freedom and Resentment paper in 1962. I think there was just the 50th anniversary of this recently. She thinks that the connection between freedom and friendship goes via the reactive attitudes. What are the reactive attitudes? Attitudes like resentment, indignation, gratitude, forgiveness, reactions that we have to each other that seem to presuppose that their objects are free agents. So, you're kind of resenting your friend who's not meeting you when they said they would, and then you find out they were, tied to a chair by some burglar in their home, and then hopefully, your resentment dissipates, right? So there's this idea that these attitudes presuppose the free agency of their objects. And so according to Wolf and others, if we were to give these up, these attitudes that presuppose our free agency, then we wouldn't be able to take things personally. We wouldn't be able to have the kind of personal relationships that we have with each other. Okay, so those are two big ideas. Recently, there's been criticism of both of these. Criticism I'm actually pretty sympathetic to, even though, as you'll see, I like the conclusion. So I'll just be very brief with these two. So, for example, Dirk Pereboom has argued against the free choice connection in the following kind of way. So, first, the one move is to say, well, maybe we don't even want, free choice. Maybe that's not even something that's so desirable, and maybe this comes out more when you think about romantic relationships. Kind of think, you want someone just to fall in love with you, right? You don't want it to be like this big choice, and they think, okay, well, it could go either way, and what should I do? And so maybe it's not even something that's always desirable. And then he also points out that, some ways of entering relationships that are unfree do seem problematic, like if you were just given a drug or something. But that's not the way it has to work, right? So you can have a relationship that you didn't freely choose that could still be a genuine friendship of the most valuable kind. Okay. And then when it comes to the reactive attitudes connection, there's lots interesting to say here, but one kind of case, and Pereboom also, I think, takes this to be a sort of paradigm. This is near and dear to my heart, so I'll go with this one too. The parent-teenager relationship. So some of you might know what I'm talking about. Well, you all know what I'm talking about from One Direction, right? So the idea here is you, certainly as a parent, you can aspire to this sort of ideal where you still have this really close relationship to your teenager, but you don't have to have resentment or indignation. You can still take things personally, and you can still have a personal relationship without having these particular attitudes that presuppose free agency. Okay, so there's tons more to say about that, but I will leave those for now. Because what I want to do in this paper is pursue a third and I think a new kind of connection between friendship and freedom that hasn't been recognized. And the idea, just very simply, is this idea that friendship requires special obligations or duties. Just to kind of motivate this, you can think about examples where you might think you have special obligations to your friend that you don't have just to a stranger. So, your friend is stranded by the side of the road and calls you and you're really in the middle of something important, but you might think you have an obligation to go pick them up, but that's not an obligation you have to for just any stranger. Okay, so friendship requires special obligations. And then the next step is this idea that special obligations, being obligations, require free agency in order to meet them. Okay, and I just set this out as the special obligations argument on the handout. And so we get the same conclusion that friendship requires free agency. Excuse me 1 second, because I realize I don't know what time it is. Okay, so this is the argument I'd like to defend today. But before getting into the evaluation of the premises of the argument, I just want to say, and actually, since I'm here. Let me back up one more second. I think, though I want to focus on friendship, I think this argument generalizes to all kinds of personal relationships, the special relationships that we have to other people. So I already mentioned romantic relationships, parent-child, but also doctor-patient, for example, I think is another kind of special relationship that we might think of as actually partially constituted by the kinds of obligations that each has to the other. Okay, and one more thing before we get to the evaluation of the premises. I just want to compare the argument just very briefly to another argument that I have on the handout, this holding to standards idea. And this, I think, is very close to the reactive attitudes connection. So some people have, I think actually a lot of people conceive of the reactive attitudes as ways of holding other people accountable or ways of holding them to demands or to standards, something like this. And so you might think, look, you don't need to have resentment or indignation to have personal relationships with other people, but you do have to have some mechanism to say, hey, you owe me some goodwill or something like that. And so I think you could think the reactive attitudes folks, they were onto something, even though the reactive attitudes played a role, sort of contingently, that could be played by other things, but that's an important role. And so the holding to standards argument says, okay, friendship requires the appropriate holding to standards, appropriately holding to standards requires free agency, so we get our conclusion, friendship requires free agency. And the reason I put these two arguments together is just, I think it's, as we'll see, they bring two very different literatures together. So in the literature on moral theory, premise one gets a lot of attention, and we'll talk about that and why. Friendship requires special obligations or duties. But then in the free will literature, that's almost, that's not talked about very much. Instead, you get a discussion of something like 1 prime. This idea that friendship requires the appropriate holding to standards. Okay, so part of my aim in the paper is actually just to bring these two literatures together and see if they can illuminate each other. And my own view is that maybe the holding to standard arguments is right, but that the more fundamental point is the obligations idea. So insofar as we do have standing to ask certain things of other people, it's because they have obligations and vice versa. Okay, the other people would flip this and go the other way, but I'm going to focus on the special obligations argument. Okay, so just, we'll start with premise one. And here I'm going to consider a couple of different big categories of objections to it, and then try to say something positive about how these obligations are grounded. And the first kind of objection comes from consequentialists. And you can see they will have a lot of motivation to reject premise one, because according to consequentialists, what matters morally is just the consequences of your actions. So to take a sort of paradigm maximizing consequentialist view, you could just think, look, there's just a single obligation, maximize value or maximize utility, and that's the sort of general obligation or duty that there is, and then there wouldn't be any special duties that you didn't have to everybody in virtue of this general obligation. Okay, so that's one kind of objection we'll look at in just a second. Then I want to consider maybe an even more radical kind of objection to this premise, and that's an objection that we just don't have any obligations at all. Okay, so just to start, so try to start to motivate this already, that you have special obligations. I know my example is picking up your friend from the airport. This is for all of us who live in cities where there aren't subways and trains and all that. This becomes like a really important thing, especially if you're a graduate student to get a ride from the airport. Or just being there for your friend when she's going through a hard time or something like that. And these seem like cases, even those who ultimately want to reject premise one, as we'll see, concede that this is kind of the common sense sort of view, that it does seem plausible that we have these obligations to our friends that we don't have to other people and so on. Okay, so, but consequentialists motivated to reject this premise have lots of strategies, so they're very rich in resources here. And I'll just go through some quickly and then one in more detail. So one of the strategies is to explain away this appearance that we have special obligations to our friends. And one, this goes back, I guess, at least to Sidgwick 100 plus years ago, this idea that the general obligation to maximize value or maximize utility turns out to recommend that you do nice things for your friends, because it turns out to be easier to get higher value, more bang for your buck with people who are close to you than strangers far away, say. But I think it's pretty well recognized that this is not so plausible now. I mean, you can take your friend out to dinner, or you could buy, I don't know, some of you probably know how many Oxfam meals you could buy to serve children who are undernourished. And it looks like, I don't know, maybe I could get more bang for my buck not doing something right for my friends. So these won't line up, in fact. A second kind of strategy, and I think this also goes back to Sidgwick, is this idea that the cultivation of dispositions toward favoring your friends and toward being friends with people can itself be maximizing of value, even if those dispositions lead you on occasion to do something that's morally wrong, that actually doesn't maximize value. But overall, having those dispositions will produce the most value. Okay, so that's another kind of strategy. We'll talk a little more about this in a bit. Another idea is another way of trying to accommodate the kind of intuitions we have about what we should do for our friends, is to think that helping your friends actually has more value. So a friend helping a friend just has more intrinsic value than a stranger helping a stranger, say. I mean, again, I think this is only going to go so far, because you might think, well, I could help my friend, that would be better than just doing the same thing for a stranger, but I might be able to help another friendship flourish, and then where would I be, right? I could help two friendships flourish instead of just my own. Okay, so now I want to engage in a couple of other strategies. I think you could combine some of these strategies, but I think this kind of, let's see, so the idea here is to try to offer, on the positive side, a kind of conception of friendship that's more minimalist, but still very rich, and that kind of captures what we want in the idea of friendship. And here I draw on some work, actually, of one of my colleagues, Dick Arneson, who offers a conception of friendship that includes mutual affection, care, a strong desire to help each other, and so on. And it looks like, well, that's really great, and maybe we don't have any special obligations to each other, but all this stuff sort of sets us apart from just any two people. That seems right. He also acknowledges, well, maybe you need one other ingredient, and that is, maybe you can't just have the desire to help each other and be friends, because you might have that actually for lots of all kinds of people. Maybe you even need this will to favor your friend, even when it would be wrong, and still not have special obligations. But that's okay, says Arneson, because on this picture, it's true that having this kind of will would dispose you to act wrongly in the future, but that's okay, because on this picture there are norms of friendship, but they're not moral norms. And so it's okay that you could be friends and have these dispositions, but acting on them at some point would just be morally wrong. Okay. And then there's one more ingredient to this idea that I think is really interesting, and this I want to explore in a little detail. And that is, his idea is that, I'll just quote, because I think I actually put this on the handout. He says, the common sense view about the special ties of friendship is just an artifact of current widespread dismissal of act consequentialism. So his idea is, if you can we're in the grip of a non-consequentialist picture. And that's what allows us to think that friendship does require these special obligations. But if we just saw the light and understood consequentialism to be the true view, then we would be content with this more minimalist picture of friendship. That's the idea. I think there's something to this. And one reason that I think he's onto something here is maybe other people can correct me, but I've only managed to find one example of someone defending a more minimalist conception of friendship as not requiring special obligations who is not a consequentialist or is not embedded in that kind of picture. This is Mark Bernstein in a 2007 paper. And I think I understand why. So on this non-consequentialist view, right, we do have lots of permissions that you don't have on the consequentialist theory. But then it seems like if you could help your friend, or you could do something else, like play on your phone or whatever it is, and neither one is morally wrong, and you're not required to do anything for your friend, and you just don't. I think at some point there, I start to think, well, are you really friends? What does it mean if you wouldn't be violating any obligation by doing this, even when your friend is in some need? Okay. And so I think this kind of thought can actually support the consequentialist defense of the minimalist conception of friendship. And here's how. You might think, okay, yeah, if I'm just choosing between playing a game on my phone or helping my friend who needs help, then it looks like we're not friends. But what if I'm on my way to meet her, and right in front of me there's a hit and run accident, and I can save her by rushing her to the hospital? It seems like, well, of course that's what I should do, and I'm not being a bad friend by doing that instead. I'm not violating an obligation. Even if that happened, over the course of a week or so, and I just get really bad luck, this keeps happening, it seems like, okay, but we're still friends, and I still have this obligation. I'm not violating an obligation. And then you might think, this reasoning is on the handout, could think, okay, so take this kind of to the extreme. Suppose that consequentialism is the true moral theory, and so there aren't any special obligations. I've just always got this general obligation to fulfill. Then it seems like, well, similarly, why can't I still be a friend? I'm just obligated in a different way to fulfill this general obligation. Okay, so that I think is a really neat argument, and I think it shows that the consequentialists really can avoid a kind of counterintuitive implication of trying to have a minimalist conception of friendship on a non-consequentialist view. Okay. But in the end, despite this advantage, so I've just said how great I think this reasoning is and how neat it is, but I don't think it works in the end. And there are a couple of reasons for this. So one is that, I guess, one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens. You can go the other way, right? So here the argument, I think this is what Arneson has in mind. You think if consequentialism is true, then yeah, that's the best we can do, and that's perfectly sufficient for friendship without special obligations. But then you could think, wow, there are special obligations, so consequentialism has to be false, right? And here I'm just going to appeal to my other colleague. This is kind of perfect for me, having all these people around. David Brink, who does go the other way. And he's an interesting case because I think he's otherwise very sympathetic to consequentialism. He's not worried, as some other people are, that consequentialism is so demanding and that's why it can't be true. He's actually worried that it doesn't account for his other demands, right? These special ones. So as he puts it, he says, my doubts about whether associative duties can be fitted within the intellectual net of consequentialism have been fueled in part by my own experiences of the rewards and demands of parenthood. If these doubts are well founded, then consequentialism cannot be the whole truth of morality, right? So you could just go the other way. Okay. But beyond that, I also want to question this reasoning that seems to make the more minimalist conception of friendship plausible. And to do this, I just just want to point to some disanalogies between the first kinds of cases where you have the accident victim in your path. Some disanalogies between those cases and the case where consequentialism is true. So on the one hand, in the first kind of case, we still can say all kinds of things about your special obligations, right? So you might no longer be obligated to meet your friend when you said you would, but you do have another, you've acquired these second best obligations, as I would put them. Now you need to call when you can, or reschedule, or something like that. So you still get obligations. We can also say, okay, you had the obligation, but it was overridden by this other one. Maybe you acquire conditional obligations. If I'm able to call her, I will. And finally, I think these counterfactuals can be true of you, that were circumstances different, or were you to have not, your timing weren't so bad and the accident hadn't happened right then, you would have been there and should have been. And I think you can't say any of these sorts of things in the case where we're imagining that consequentialism is just a true moral theory. And that may be enough of a reason to think, yeah, maybe you wouldn't have friendship in that case. I think the best that you could get is something like a counterfactual like this. If moral theory were different, if there were different true moral theory, then I would have a special obligation to be there for you. But I think that's such a very different kind of counterfactual than, had the accident not happened or had circumstances not been different, then I should have been there for you. Okay. There's more to say about counterfactuals, but I'll just, for now, say I think that what this shows is that at best, on the consequentialist picture, maybe we could think, yeah, you could still capture quite a bit that's important to us about friendship. You could still have the mutual care and things like that. But you may not have friendship, right? So at the end of the day, I think that this kind of attempt to argue by analogy from the kind of accident cases won't generate the intuition that you can still have friendship even in the absence of these special obligations. Okay, so I'll just turn to one more objection to the first premise, and this I'll be briefer with this one. Recently there's been I'm going to focus on an argument by Dirk Perregum, but I think it has a certain I think there's a real appeal to this. The idea that maybe we don't have any obligations at all. And one way of getting to this, which we'll talk more about in just a bit, is this idea that if ought implies can, and you just can't, then it's not true that you ought, right? And that's a very simple, nutshell kind of case. But you could get there in a number of ways. You could think, well, again, if determinism is true, you can never do anything differently from what you do. And so if you don't do something, it can't be that you ought to have done it, right? You couldn't, so it's not true that you ought to have done it. Okay, so that's one way of kind of getting to a kind of skepticism about obligation generally. Okay, but Perregum wants to keep friendship, of course, and other personal relationships. And one of the strategies, he's got various strategies. I'm just going to focus on two elements of it here. One is to try to, again, save much of what we want, or much of what we think constitutes friendship, without obligations. And the way one of the sort of elements of this suggestion is to distinguish between different kinds of oughts. This is a familiar kind of move in other contexts. So there's the ought, as he calls it, of action demand. This is on your handout. And that's the kind of ought that seems to require the ability to do what you ought. But then there are other kinds of times when we say, hey, you ought to do this. And what we mean is, it would be better if you did this. And so you could think of that as a kind of, as he puts it, an axiological recommendation, recommending an action as good. And then put this together with an idea that we can still maybe talk about wrongness, even if we're not talking about obligation. Maybe what we could do it this way is by thinking what is wrong is what is appropriate to protest. Okay, so this works well. So I have a kind of illustrative example on the handout, and it's in an interpersonal relationship, two partners, say, two spouses, and one is abusive toward the other, and I put these kind of in order, bad to better, bad on the bottom, better on the top. So continuing to be abusive, that's really bad, and in fact it's so bad it's appropriate to protest, and that makes it wrong. Better would be ceasing that behavior, and even better would be ceasing that behavior and doing something nice, like, I don't know, none of my examples work for New York City. Who's washing the car? But anyway, you could think that that's even better. Okay, so you have this axiological scale for bad to better, but only the first one is wrong. Okay, so it looks like, well, maybe we can capture a lot of what we want to capture in interpersonal relationships without special obligations. Okay, so just very briefly, I don't think this is going to work as it is. Maybe there's a way of making it work. But for the moment, I think especially when we focus on cases that are really specific to a personal relationship, we'll see that it's not going to be so easy to draw these lines in the neat way that we did up here in the first case. So the first case is a kind of, abuse happens within relationships, but it's bad anywhere, right? It's just morally bad. But take a kind of friendship case like the ones we've been talking about. And so take our case. So you could continue to play your video games, or you could pick up your friend who needs a ride, or you could help another slightly more valuable friendship flourish, or equally valuable, plus throw in, I don't know, an ice cream or something. Okay, now we have from bad to better, it looks like, A, B, C. But where are we supposed to draw the line, right? It looks like continuing just to play your game when your friend needs help, that would be wrong. But then again, I think your friend could protest, right, or object, even if you helped this other friendship and gave someone an ice cream. They might think, hey, I thought we were friends, right? And so it looks like this is a kind of case where it's not clear that we could just draw a line in the scale of bad to better in a way that will actually map onto something like how we think about our relations to friends. Okay. Now there may be, I think the best way of approaching this might be to kind of separate the idea of wrongness from the axiological ranking. Right? Then you could say both A and C are wrong. But then I think this raises a question, I think it's a question you have anyway on this kind of view. Okay, how do we capture what is appropriate to protest? How are we going to capture that without relying on something like the idea that, well, friends are supposed to do this for each other, or, they've got these obligations. So it's unclear that we're going to be able to make this work. Okay, so far so good. So I'll just very briefly say something about, can we say anything positive about the claim that friendship gives us special obligations? And here, this is going to be super sketchy, but I'll give you just the key elements that I'm thinking go into it right now. So I'm open to there being a kind of pluralist grounding of special obligations, so that you could think, some of them, maybe marriage, maybe doctor-patient is like this too, are sort of paradigmatic of what I would think of as a voluntarist approach, where you just, according to the narrowest version of this, you make an explicit promise, you sign something, or you make some promise, vows of marriage or something like that. Sort of voluntarily having children would be of this sort too. Maybe not quite as narrow a version of it. But the idea is that you could, maybe that sort of voluntary assumption of obligations accounts for some of our special obligations, and maybe others have other kinds of grounds. So some folks have talked about, you know, having obligations of gratitude when you've received benefits, for example. So sometimes people who think that children have obligations to their parents have this kind of view. Okay, and I think in principle we can be, I'm just for now going to be very open to a kind of pluralism about this. But I found myself recently really attracted to the idea that voluntarism can take care of a lot of the cases, as long as we don't think of it necessarily as requiring an explicit promise or contract or anything. But you know, I think you can engage in voluntary activities that will amount to the assumption of responsibility. Okay. And so the idea here is, as long as this kind of grounds of special obligations is part of the picture of friendship, for example, then I think we can see a couple of different things. I think we can see that that just like promising, for example, that it is like promising in the grounds of the obligations, they are moral obligations, right, of the same kind of sort as something like promising. Okay. Now, some folks have worried that if our obligations of friendship are just moral, then they're not special anymore. They're not, you know, unique to friendship, or we don't have them. We don't have these obligations to each other, qua friends or partners or things like that. We just, you know, they're just regular old moral obligations, and that sort of takes some of the cool part of it out. So, for example, Jay Wallace has this view. So he thinks of a theory like this. He would say this is a theory, a reductionist theory. You're just reducing these special obligations to these more general moral ones, and so you've lost what's special about them. But I think this is not quite the right way to see it. I think it's true that they are moral, and they compete with moral obligations. But I think you can still see them as special because their content is special. And you have an obligation toward your friend to be a good friend, right? Which is quite different from your obligation to a stranger on the street. And so I think because once you distinguish between the content and the kinds of grounds, you can still preserve what he calls genuine obligations of friendship and love and so on, and still think that these are moral obligations. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with Professor Scheffler. I think has a different way of, uses reductionist in a different way, actually, in thinking about this, these sorts of duties. And so for him, reductionism, I think, comes to the idea that special obligations are grounded in discrete interactions, whereas the non-reductionist view is just one where you can appeal to the relationship itself. But here, too, I think the view I'm defending definitely counts as reductionist, but it's not all bad in this way, right? So you can still truly say, I think you should do it because you're friends. It's just that you're friends in part because you have these special obligations. Okay. So I think this has a couple of nice implications. One is that it's good that the obligations are moral, in contrast to the consequentialist idea that we were talking about earlier, where there are norms of friendship, but they're not moral norms. And at the same time, I think we still capture this idea that we started with, that we do have these they're special obligations. Okay. Okay, so I'm running low on time, but I'll just say something briefly about, in defense of the second premise. Matthew, maybe you can tell me.
We started later.
Okay. Okay. So I will. So the second premise, just going back a bit. Let's see. Takes you to this idea that why have we worked so hard to try to show that we have special obligations? Because having special obligations, now we can see that if you have these obligations of friendship, just as you would have obligations of more just general moral obligations, requires free agency of a kind, Okay, and to see this, we kind of touched on this a little bit. So I actually kind of like the idea that we talked about before that I was attributing to skeptics about obligation, like Dirk Perigum, that yeah, maybe when you think about what implies can, a certain kind of can implicates a certain kind of control and freedom that you need in order to have obligations. So I want to reject the skepticism, but I want to keep that idea. I'm not a skeptic about freedom, so it's easy for me to sign on to this, to say that that having obligations does require us to have precisely the kind of freedom or control that has been thought to be needed for moral responsibility. Okay. Okay, so there are two parts to this. One is the ought implies can principle itself. And I'm going to say almost nothing about why you should accept this. I do try in other places to defend this idea. But what I want to focus on, so take the argument to be conditional in a way. If you accept something like this, this idea that if you ought to do something, then you can do it, you think that obligation is action guiding in a way that requires the ability to do it. Then the question becomes how to understand the can. What does that mean? Okay, and so one way of seeing how we get to this is to think, so some people have thought that if determinism is true and you can't do otherwise, then you can't have obligations. But it looks like just adding a little indeterminism doesn't give you the relevant ability either, right? If you just say, oh, well, it might happen, the laws of nature leave it open that, you might meet your friend. It seems like, well, yeah, but does that give me the ability to meet my friends? It doesn't seem sufficient for that. So it looks like, I think that's a way of sort of generating the reaction that, yeah, you need some kind of control, you need some kind of freedom to meet the obligation. Just as an aside, I think the whole discussion of determinism is orthogonal to this. So I am myself a compatibilist about determinism and freedom, but I just want to get you into the mood for this in thinking about it this way. Okay. So the idea is that that having an obligation requires having free agency to meet it. Okay. Let's see. And then I won't read through these, but I just have a couple of quotes on the handout for you, one from Perigum and one from Ish Haji, that I think are bringing out this kind of idea as well. Okay. And I think this fits nicely, of course, with the view I defend about what freedom amounts to. So this is a view I've defended elsewhere too. And the basic idea is that one acts freely insofar as one has the ability to do the right thing for the right reasons. Okay, and so this is on your handout. So you see this in Susan Wolf's work, and I've defended something like this too. And you can see this fits really nicely, I think, with the special obligations argument and with that second premise. There's this idea that what it is to act freely is to have precisely this ability. So if you do what you ought to do, then you've got this ability. And if you fail to do what you ought to do, you better have had the ability to do otherwise. You have to have been able to do what you ought. Okay. Now this doesn't mean that having this kind of freedom automatically gets you to moral responsibility. There may be more ingredients, but the idea is that there is this sort of minimal control condition, a freedom condition, that's required both for moral responsibility and for having obligations. Okay. Okay, so just to kind of sum things up then. Let's see. So I've argued that philosophers have been right to see an essential connection between friendship and freedom. And so they were right. That is one of the great goods that's at stake in the free will debate. But at the same time, I've departed started from this recent debate about the reactive attitudes, as much as I'm interested in that. And instead I've tried to provide a different kind of connection between friendship and freedom, one based on obligations. And I think both have the ability to explain why friendship and moral responsibility go together, why they're sort of threatened in a similar way by challenges from free agency. But I've tried to argue that the most fundamental concern or connection turns on obligations of a certain sort. And reactive attitudes come into it, but that's kind of dependent on the idea of obligations. Okay, so as I'm sure you all will inform me in various ways in the Q&A, the argument I've given is definitely not complete, but I'll start you off. Here are a couple of ways in which it's not. So in arguing for the first premise of the special obligations argument, the claim that friendship is partially constituted by a relationship of mutual obligation, I've tried to show that the best hope for rejecting it is conditional on consequentialism, so that gets you part way. And I've tried to show the costs to consequentialism concerning friendship itself, but obviously I have not offered a complete case against consequentialism. And similarly, in arguing for premise 2, I've tried to show that once you've got the ought implies can principle, then you have strong reason to think that obligation requires free agency of the relevant kind. But I haven't, obviously, I haven't here rehearsed the reasons that you should accept the ought implies can principle itself. So what I've tried to do is offer a framework for the special obligations argument that connects freedom and friendship. And I've tried to show that the framework itself is part of a promising picture of our deepest concerns about whether we're free agents. Thank you.